Welcome, everybody. We're very pleased that you've joined us today for this event to discuss the ideas presented in Professor Douglas Kaiser's new book, Regulating from Nowhere, Environmental Law and the Search for Objectivity. I'm Caroline Fredrickson. I'm the Executive Director at the American Constitution Society for Law and Policy, known fondly to all of you as ACS. ACS, for any of you who are not yet familiar with us, is a national network of lawyers, law professors and law students, policymakers and judges dedicated to promoting the vitality of our Constitution and the fundamental values it expresses: individual rights and liberties, genuine equality, access to justice, democracy, and the rule of law. The legal and policy communities in Washington and across the country have watched closely efforts to pass comprehensive climate change legislation. We've monitored debates about various cap and trade proposals and waited nervously to see whether California voters, through the ballot initiative known as Proposition 23, would suspend California's landmark state climate change legislation. And now we happily know the answer to that. But focusing on particular pieces of legislation or policy, while important, is clearly not enough. From time to time, it is so important for us to step back. We have to address the deeper issues and ask the larger questions, such as, is the theoretical framework that undergirds much of our present environmental regulations serving us well? Can a paradigm that requires weighing the net benefits of proposed governmental action really account for the multi-generational, global, and cultural costs of something like climate change? Which voices and communities are routinely left out of the process of assessing the costs and benefits of proposed policy? In looking at these questions, we have the benefit of Professor Kaiser's new book. Drawing upon an array of sources, including moral philosophy, political theory, cognitive psychology, ecology, and science and technology studies, he offers a fresh theoretical basis for environmental law and policy. This is obviously a complicated and tricky terrain, but we have a wonderful panel of experts who can help us who are not as well-versed in environmental policy understand the core issues of the book and in the discussion. Our moderator will introduce each of the panelists, but I have the real pleasure of introducing our moderator, Professor Sheila Jasanoff. Fully enumerating Dr. Jasanoff's credentials would take more time than we have today because of her truly amazing background. So I will point you to the handout you got to further understand what all of her accomplishments are. So I will be very brief. Dr. Jasanoff is the Pforzheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies at Harvard's Kennedy School. Her work explores the role of science and technology in law, politics, and the policy of modern democracies. She is a pioneer in her field and has authored more than 100 articles and chapters, and is the author or editor of a dozen books, including Science at the Bar and Designs on Nature. Among her many awards are a 2010 Guggenheim Fellowship and an Ehrenkreuz from the government of Austria. She holds AB, JD, and PhD degrees from Harvard. We are extremely fortunate to have her here today. Sheila?
Thank you very much, Caroline. I feel actually myself extremely fortunate to be here today, partly because of the auspices under which we've all been brought together and the purposes of ACS as you described them, but partly also because we're discussing a book which is one of the very few I've picked up in the last 5 years, of which I can genuinely say it excited me and I wish I'd written pieces of it myself. We have an enormously interesting set of commentators, as well as an enormously exciting and accomplished author with us. What I want to do is situate the book in a number of conversations that I hope will be relevant or will be thought relevant by everybody in this room. So one of the fascinating things that Doug Kaiser does in his book and in his work is span the domain that Caroline Fredrickson just talked about, from high theory at one end. How many of you feel able to cite Derrida and Agamben and Habermas, and also end your book with a model statute? So this is not an ordinary law professor, but then he teaches at Yale. So, we know that's a kind of esoteric breed of personality. But I think you can situate the book in three kind of concentric or overlapping circles that represent this spectrum, from the Derrida-esque playfulness with language to the hardcore attempt to actually change the law as it's practiced. So let me begin with the narrowest. We did have an election in America a couple of days ago, and we're probably all still digesting it. But at one level, it can be read as a repudiation of what has been the dominant idea for policy in the area of climate change for the last umpteen years. And certainly at the Kennedy School, cap and trade has been the mantra of the moment for quite a few moments running. So the question is, what is the repudiation of cap and trade about? And I think that one of the conversations that the book leads us to is thinking more deeply about that very question. So is it a repudiation of a particular policy instrument? Is it a repudiation of the idea that America should be involved in any international negotiations under any circumstances at all? Or is it a repudiation of the idea that a dominant policy instrument has taken hold that did not adequately account for people's felt ideas about what the costs and benefits are, and hence what's being repudiated is an overly early and perhaps not sufficiently nuanced narrowing of the analytic playing field to a particular set of costs and benefits that are then put under cap and trade. So I think, or I want to think, that that discussion is actually open, and that some people may think that they're sponsoring or favoring one argument there, like repudiating America's internationalism. I think we have a chance to alter the discourse and to tune it in other directions, like bringing in the kinds of fundamental value questions that Doug addresses in his book. A second level at which the book works, and very self-consciously so, is to situate itself in a number of ongoing, really deep, contested ideas about what kinds of democracies we should have. And it's well to remember that we utter that word all the time: democratic values, democratic governance, democratic policy options, but very few of us have actually stopped to think about what that means. And there are as many flavors of democracy abroad in the world as certainly countries that consider themselves democratic, and these days perhaps the classic definition of the NGO is 3 people with a T-shirt, but it's 3 people with a website. And so there are, many different ideas abroad. So in a time like that, like this one, the digital world, where people can glom themselves together at the drop of, or at the click of a mouse, I think it's useful to be reminded what some of the ongoing binaries are that characterize democracies. And Doug's book touches on all of them. And I'll just name these binaries with a couple of questions that I think we might keep our minds on. So first of all, are we in a risk world or a precaution world? Risk is calculable almost by definition. Precaution deals with non-calculability. I think we know where Doug comes out himself, but there is a fairly deep question for policymakers faced with choices between calculable policy instruments and non-calculable types of concerns that are facing us out there. What do we do? So risk precaution is one of those dimensions. Market or state? It's an ongoing debate about the nature of a democratic government, how much market, how much state, and for EPA it has been a real question throughout its working life. Individualism, communitarianism. To what extent are judgments supposed to be made at the level of the individual in the discourse of rights, and to what extent should we be considering as well or instead relational values, the ways in which we are situated in larger constructs and what we owe to those constructs. Utilitarianism versus deontological reasoning. These are fairly familiar philosophical systems, but they lead to very different kinds of policy consequences depending on whether you think costs and benefits can be balanced or whether you think there are some fundamental principles that you should not trade away. And attached to all of that are debates about national sovereignty versus transnationalism. So are we the kind of democratic state that is entirely for itself or for itself first, America for Americans? What does it even mean? And I think that in order to come out at conclusions that are relevant for environmental policy, we have to ask whether these different binaries, the 5 I've laid out, which are not exclusive, but they are important, do they align? I mean, that is, do we get individualism, risk, market, utilitarianism, and sovereignty necessarily on one side of the ledger and the others necessarily on the other side? And are they binaries or are they spectra? And if so, how do we locate ourselves in the space that's defined by all these dimensions? The third dimension, or the third circle in which I want to situate Doug's book, is to me the most exciting one, but I am and have the luxury of being an academic. But I think Doug is also unabashedly that. This is the discussion about constitutional moments, most associated in the literature with Doug's colleague and my friend Bruce Ackerman. This idea makes the argument that constitutions are not just the documents that were written down a number of hundred years ago, nor the interpretive texts that have grown up around that, but that constitutions are much more open-ended philosophical documents about the ways in which we should think about governing ourselves. I personally think that we are in a major constitutional moment now on a worldwide scale, similar to that of the late 18th century, when we had the French Revolution and the American Revolution back to back, and the rise of the nation-state system that gathered force and strength throughout the 19th century. So I think that today we are at the threshold of an era where we absolutely have to think of planetary governance to an extent. And I think that, in a way, America's major technological achievement of the newest frontier, the Apollo mission, had the ironic sub-effect of forcing our minds and our eyes to thinking about the biosphere as the space within which we're contained. So I think that the question for law that arises and is, sort of played out in different harmonies throughout Doug's book is, what role does American constitutional law have in charting the course towards this new era in which we have to think of supranational governance, and it is just no longer an issue for us whether we're going to sit out on the sidelines or not. So I think that in this particular constitutional moment where environmental concerns are prompting us to think of ourselves not just as NIMBY folks situated in our own backyards, but also as citizens of the planet, what kind of governance system do we want, and how do the tools of governance that we have, such as cost-benefit analysis or Doug's American Possibilities Act, how do those instruments actually situate themselves in a much wider domain of constitutional thinking? So that's how I see the book. That's why I think it is crucially important. People talk about short centuries and long centuries. Short centuries begin in years beginning with 10. So we're now at the beginning of the short 21st century. It's a wonderful moment, a constitutional moment, at which to have a further discussion of your book. So I think I'll let you speak first for 10 minutes. And, well, I've already said a number of things about who you are, but I'll just repeat what you, I think, have in your materials. So Doug Kaiser is the Joseph M. Field Professor of Law at Yale Law School. And in addition to this book, he is one of the co-authors of a leading casebook on tort law, The Torts Process, with a number of distinguished co-authors. And Doug will speak for about 10 minutes about the book, and then I'll introduce the two commentators.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm really grateful to ACS for hosting this event, to Praveen Fernandez for kind of conceiving of it and bringing it to fruition. I'm really also grateful to the folks to my right and left for being willing to spend time to engage with the book and then to have this conversation. I'm really excited to hear from them, and so I'm going to try to keep these introductory remarks very brief. I'm able to do that because Dr. Jasanoff just did such a remarkable job, I think, summarizing the things I'm groping toward or grappling with, and I really can't improve on that. And I just, as an aside, would like to thank Dr. Jasanoff especially for being willing to be here and do this. This is a deep honor for me. You've been an enormous influence on my thinking, my living, and so it's great to be here. So I thought maybe I would talk about a very important concrete development in the area of environmental health and safety policy that kind of postdated the publication of the book, but that I think really elucidates a lot of the book's themes. And that's the development of a formal, uniform federal social cost of carbon. This is a measure that was conducted by an interagency task force developed by the Obama administration, and that will now be used in any major rulemaking that affects greenhouse gas emissions. It will be used to quantify the social benefits of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the task force authors who came up with this report actually did quite a good job by the standards of the regulatory cost-benefit analysis literature. There were remarkable levels of candor and humility in the report. There was a kind of unusual forthrightness about limitations of the cost-benefit methodology in this domain. But at the end of the day, they still did come up with a number. And my fear is that the number is not just rough and incomplete, but the number might be an affirmatively harmful distraction. And to understand why, think about the pursuit of social welfare maximization, which is what cost-benefit analysis is meant to help us do. Think about that pursuit as an effort to climb a particular mountain. So we evaluate policies in terms of whether their total social costs and benefits will lead us incrementally up or down the mountain that we're on. And the fundamental problem in the climate change world is that cost-benefit analysis can't tell us whether we're on the right mountain to begin with. And that is, at the base of any cost-benefit exercise is a set of fundamental assumptions about things like resource rights, income distribution, population size, intergenerational responsibility, international obligations, the state of technology, the pace of innovation, the ability of societies to adapt to climate change, the trajectory of the economy, and so on and so on. All of these assumptions are lying at the base of any particular cost-benefit exercise, and if we alter them, if we change them, then we radically change the status quo. We end up on a different mountain. Once we're on that different mountain, cost-benefit analysis can again tell us whether any individual incremental step will lead us up or down. But it can't tell us which mountain to be on in the first place. And the problem here is that the universal, near universal view of natural scientists is that we are right now on the wrong mountain. We're on a mountain that, because of tipping points in both ecological and socioeconomic systems, is a mountain with a cliff at its peak. So we're well advised at present to take policy steps that might appear inefficient when we measure them using cost-benefit analysis that's fixed to the status quo assumptions at its base. So we may have to, in other words, climb down a little bit before we can start climbing up again a different peak, a peak with a much more enduring and, in the long run, better view. Now, the authors of the task force report did acknowledge this fundamental distinction between choosing a mountain and then climbing it. Or to put the point more technically, between general equilibrium and partial equilibrium, or comprehensive efficiency analysis versus marginal efficiency analysis. But the authors still confidently stated in their report that the social cost of carbon will be useful because, quote, most federal regulatory actions can be expected to have only marginal impacts on global emissions. Now, the danger here is that that assertion will be self-fulfilling. Whether or not the Clean Air Act offers only marginal possibilities for affecting emissions trajectories depends very much on whether EPA implements the statute with the health-based technology forcing teeth that it was designed to have. If EPA does come up with a full-throated implementation of the Clean Air Act, it would represent the kind of potentially transformative, potentially general equilibrium shifting that the task force authors say is not appropriate for cost-benefit analysis. But the problem is that EPA's implementation is going to be subjected to review by OIRA using marginalist cost-benefit analysis. And that cost-benefit analysis will misunderstand the aim of the regulations, and it will misleadingly label them inefficient. The integrated assessment models, the economic models that were used by this task force to come up with a social cost of carbon, they depend on assumptions about fundamental aspects of the climate change problem that are never allowed to surface for direct inspection. So one of the key assumptions in all of the models used by the EPA or by the agency task force was that U.S. policies will never affect other nations' policies. So there was no allowance for the possibility that a major U.S. policy shift would cause other nations to follow suit. And so the apparent benefits of any U.S. climate policy is going to be understated if it's true, as most knowledgeable observers suggest, that the major impediment to international cooperation at the moment is U.S. recalcitrance. Likewise, each of the three models that were used by the task force make heroically optimistic assumptions about humanity's ability to adapt to climate change without cost. So one model, for instance, is built on such rosy assumptions that it predicts net gains from climate change up to a 3 degrees Celsius temperature increase, when the active debate in the scientific community is whether we could even tolerate a 2-degree increase without crossing critical thresholds that might fundamentally affect life-supporting systems. One of the models in particular, the DICE model, which has been long influential in U.S. policy, contains a damage function that's so optimistic, temperature can increase to apocalyptic levels within the model and still not fundamentally affect economic growth. So you can go up to a 19 degrees Celsius temperature increase in this model and still generate half of world GDP. Now, consider that in light of the fact that scientists have recently identified what they call an adaptability limit to climate change, which is due to the fact that we have a biophysical limitation in our ability to dissipate heat. Our metabolism can only handle so much. At some point, we suffer hyperthermia. And the researchers calculate that at a warming of 11 to 12 degrees Celsius, all currently inhabited areas by humans on the globe would no longer be suitable for human existence. Now, how can it be that half of world GDP would continue to be generated in a world in which we've passed this adaptability limit? Well, the reason is that the climate models simply don't contemplate, they don't allow for the possibility of an infra-marginal event like that. So rather than positing some degree of fundamental dependence between socioeconomic systems like markets and natural systems like the atmosphere, instead, the economy can continue to function more or less as is in the model, even as climate damages grow ever larger. So that kind of marginalist cost-benefit optimizing might just simply be the wrong framework for thinking about climate change policy. And the book argues that, in fact, much of environmental health and safety law is being distorted and confused by applying that wrong lens. And so its aims are being misunderstood. So the economic approach condemns laws as inefficient without really understanding what it is that they're trying to do. So the monetary value of human lives is made to depend on the apparent willingness to pay of blue-collar workers to trade off income for occupational risk, when instead the value of those workers' lives was meant to be enhanced through democratically conferred legal protections. The environmental fate of future generations is made to depend on values like the present market rate of interest, when instead those values, the market rate of interest, should emerge from a democratically conferred sustainability constraint that's placed on market operations beforehand. The likelihood that uncertain but potentially catastrophic events will occur is made to depend on very subjective estimates of technocrats, when instead that likelihood should depend on whether the responsible political community is willing to countenance disaster among its legacy of achievements. So the promise of environmental law is that the needs of future generations and non-human life forms and other missing interest holders can be given foundational legal importance, so that the ensuing costs and benefits that are read by economists from the market will reflect a prior determination by the political community to pursue environmental sustainability. Instead, proponents of cost-benefit analysis try to force sustainability into an pre-existing cost and benefit schedule that's more or less arbitrarily privileged. So lawmaking on this account comes to mean ever more refined tinkering with a given system, the unexamined rules of which form the set of constraints under which we maximize welfare. The transformative potential of law is thus curtailed. Just as economics had its marginalist revolution back in the 19th century, promoters of cost-benefit analysis want to subject law to a marginalist revolution in the 21st century. In my view, law cannot self-negate in this way. Much of our law is marginal or incremental in nature, but unless we still have potential moments of upheaval always latent within it, it ceases to be responsive to its subjects. Indeed, it ceases to be law in that it no longer represents the self-expressed commitments of an integrated political community. To commit to law is to have the power to remake it. So this suggests, in my view, a need to reinvigorate environmental law, not in welfarist terms or in technical terms, but in terms of the ethical self-understanding of its authors, which ultimately, of course, is us. And so much of the book is trying to work out a language of reinvigorating that ethical self-understanding. And I'll leave it at that. And I'm excited now to actually have a discussion about these ideas.
Thank you, Doug. Let me just quickly introduce our two distinguished commentators. Amy Sinden is Professor of Law at Temple University's Beasley School of Law. She joined that faculty after long-standing experience in public interest law. She has law clerked twice, if I understand right, for both in the U.S. District Court for the District of New Jersey and also in the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. And she was associate editor of the University of Pennsylvania Law School Review, from which she graduated summa cum laude in 1991. Jonathan Adler is professor of law and director of the Center for Business Law and Regulation at Case Western Reserve University School of Law. He teaches courses in environmental, administrative, and constitutional law, and he's been recognized repeatedly, and you'll find the details in the materials that you have, for his writing and his teaching. So in 2007, and I suppose this gives us an indication of your seniority, he was identified as the most cited legal academic in environmental law under the age of 40. And another distinction, his recent article, Money or Nothing, The Adverse Environmental Consequences of Uncompensated Law Use Controls, published in Boston College Law Review, was selected as one of the 10 best articles in land use and environmental law in 2008. He is a prolific writer and holds a BA from Yale and a JD from George Mason University School of Law. So, Amy, I believe you're next up.
Thanks, Sheila. And thanks so much for having me here. Thanks, Praveen, for inviting me. I'll just put it right out there. I love Doug's book. And so I was delighted to have an excuse and an opportunity to read it again. In the book, Doug explores with considerable depth and enormous eloquence the meta-ethical and ontological objections to welfare economics and cost-benefit analysis that most of us just experience with a sort of vague sense of unease, because at least some of us are not quite sure what meta-ethics or ontological means. But Doug, one of the things that Doug shows us in the book, or the main thing I think that he's trying to show us, is that at least some of this unease comes from the fact that these ways of thinking, these welfare economics and cost-benefit analysis ways of thinking, erase all sense of causal agency. so that under the welfare economics framework, we lose all sense of ourselves as moral agents with responsibility and subjectivity. We just become objects of analysis, statistics to be crunched in the welfare maximizing machine, as Doug says. He starts actually by drawing some of these insights from an analysis of individual ethics, but then the main move that the book makes is to then translate those to the collective level. So that what he's really trying to say is that the most important thing that we've lost through the predominance of welfare economic modes of thought is a sort of collective sense of identity and agency and responsibility. And he gives us what I thought was a wonderfully telling, although also chilling example of what he's talking about, describing an argument made by Cass Sunstein and Adrian Vermeule, where they argue that the state may in fact be obligated to adopt the death penalty on the basis of evidence that the death penalty actually deters more deaths through private murders than it requires through state-sanctioned killing. And they then actually take it even a step further to say that it might even be good policy for the government to randomly kill an innocent person as long as there was evidence that that in fact would deter even more private killings than capital punishment. In this mantra that Doug sort of repeats throughout the book, and then he says that it all depends on what the facts turn out to be. But this is a sort of extreme denial of the moral agency of the state, right? And I found it particularly resonant because I also have found myself at times horrified reading some of the arguments of Cass Sunstein, particularly with respect to international relations and climate change, where he and Eric Posner argue that the industrialized nations of the world owe no moral obligation to the developing world for having caused the global catastrophe of climate change. And in fact, they go so far as to suggest that the developing world should pay the developed world to induce us to enter into a global climate change treaty. You heard that right. India and Bangladesh would pay us to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. This is based on this sort of Coasian logic that makes the victim and the polluter disappear and sees only sort of mutually incompatible uses of property rights. The Coasian, the welfare economic view of the world, I think because it's consequentialist in outlook, erases any sense of causation, right? So that when we're only looking at consequences, the causal agent sort of drops out of view. And also because we're aggregating all effects, all benefits, all costs in this sort of grand optimific equation, we lose sight of who the losers are, who the victims are as well. So all of that, as I said, resonated with me. I found very compelling. One place where I wasn't following quite as clearly is when Doug then says that it's the precautionary principle that's going to bring this sense of agency, collective agency and responsibility sort of back into focus for us. Because I guess my sense of the precautionary principle has always been that it's fundamentally consequentialist in form, and that as such, it wouldn't be particularly concerned with causes either, right? I mean, I think of the precautionary principle as essentially saying where the consequences are uncertain or irreversible, we should be careful. So I'm not sure how the precautionary principle itself is going to inject this sense of collective agency and responsibility. Or put another way, I don't associate the precautionary principle with this distinction between action and omission, which is one of the things that Doug identifies in his book as being part of the problem with this utilitarian welfare maximizing outlook, that it obliterates the action-omission distinction. But it seems to me, when I think about the precautionary principle, that it also doesn't distinguish between acts and omissions, right? So the precautionary principle could be violated by our actions, as when we engage in activities that produce greenhouse gases, or the precautionary principle can be violated by our omissions, as when we fail to adequately maintain the levees in New Orleans. So that's my question, I guess, for Doug. I do get that the precautionary principle seems implicitly to adopt a sort of a sense of humility. And in that sense, I totally get why you put it forward as a kind of antidote to the insufferable arrogance of welfare economics, this sort of brash confidence that we can identify and measure and quantify and monetize every impact. I think the precautionary principle recognizes at its core that that's impossible. But I guess, isn't it just a more humble form of consequentialism, is my question. Thanks. I'll hand it over to Jonathan.
Well, thanks as well. It's certainly a pleasure to be here and appreciate the invitation. It's always fun to have the opportunity to exchange with Doug. This book, like pretty much everything he does, was enjoyable, provocative, occasionally a bit irksome, but in a good way. Intellectually irksome, in the sense that even if I reach points in the book and go, there's just something really wrong with this, it's an enjoyable intellectual experience, because there's an energy of produced by the provocation, and it really is was in that respect an incredibly successful book. Any book that makes you think and rethink things and make you puzzle about why you think something might be right or wrong is tremendously successful. So it's definitely a pleasure to be here to comment on it. One qualification I should make right off the bat is I suspected at one point that my designated role would be to give this categorical defense of cost-benefit analysis and utilitarian wealth maximization, and I suppose I could fake that, but that's not actually my view, and I actually agree with what I would guess characterize as many of Doug's micro critiques of cost-benefit analysis, the way it smuggles in certain normative assumptions and pretends as if they're not there, the way it elides over the impossibility of measuring and calculating certain sorts of things, the way that if we take it too seriously, it can obscure more than enlighten. I believe cost-benefit analysis can be a useful heuristic if done with a reasonable degree of humility, but it is a limited tool, and I would certainly agree that there are many economists and others who having picked up this hammer that is powerful in many circumstances, proceed to think that everything's a nail, and that's obviously a problem and doesn't always lead to better environmental policy or other sorts of policies. But I think if we're going to step back and say, what is the problem with environmental policymaking or environmental law, I'm not convinced that cost-benefit analysis is the culprit. And just to use play off one example that Doug provides in the book, and to heed the admonition of Whitehead's admonition that Doug quotes, that we should repair to the concrete. Doug tells a story of the efforts to protect New Orleans from a hurricane, and how cost-benefit analysis was misused and resulted in underprotecting the people of New Orleans. And I think it's unmistakable that the Corps of Engineers and others did not adequately anticipate the sorts of threats that could materialize. But in looking at that story, I'm not sure that the lesson is that the problem was that cost-benefit analysis was used to figure out how much should be invested and in what way to protect New Orleans. I'm sure that if I was inclined to be a robust defender of cost-benefit analysis, I would look at all the details that Doug provides and say the problem wasn't cost-benefit analysis. The problem was bad cost-benefit analysis. The problem wasn't that we tried to measure things. The problem was that we cavalierly ignored the limitations of our data, ignored the limitations of our knowledge, made assumptions that were insufficiently grounded in a sense of what it is we were trying to do, which among other things was to protect human life. And so maybe the problem wasn't cost-benefit analysis, but its implementation. I look at the story and I think in many respects the problem is the institutional structure through which cost-benefit analysis and other heuristics are applied. And the incentives they create and the agency problems they create, and that is a way to understand the failing. And so I'm not sure that cost-benefit analysis is necessarily our culprit. Our culprit may, in fact, be the institutional structures we use, and I'm inclined to think it's the institutional structures that we use for various types of collective decision-making. Institutional structures that seek to pretend that there is consensus about underlying normative or subjective questions that are really difficult. And we have what I would characterize as a pathology throughout not just environmental policy, but lots of areas of policy where we pretend as if there is this broad consensus about our goals and our aims and our values, and therefore can simply rely upon objective means of figuring out how to climb the mountain, when in fact, whatever mountain we're on, we have very different preferences, to use the mountain metaphor, of which mountain we should be on. And I think that is something that is a big problem. And just to give one example, I mean, there are a couple places where Doug talks about how we need to pay attention to the needs of life. And one place characterizes those needs as unmistakable. I don't think that's true. That in a lot of these areas, the terrain is very contested. And just to give one example that is a very micro example, I visit Yellowstone National Park almost every year. And when I go there, one of the things I really want to see are wolves. I mean, the reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone, I think, is a majestic and monumental achievement. Having seen a wolf in the wild is certainly one of my most cherished experiences. I have a very good friend who's an avid elk hunter, and he hunts with bows, which I think is crazy, but and probably inhumane, but that's another matter. And he doesn't like wolf reintroduction. Why? Well, because at the margin, reintroducing wolves reduces elk populations. Well, there are other people that really care a lot about which type of trees you have in Yellowstone, and it turns out one thing that varies with elk populations is how prevalent aspen trees are within Yellowstone. And now there is no right, objective, scientific answer whether or not we should have more wolves or more elk or more aspen. You can maximize for aspen and wolves at the same time, but you can't maximize for either of those with elk. And if we talk about what the scientists say or what the needs of life are, well, no, we're actually glossing over trade-offs, ecological trade-offs, moral trade-offs, normative trade-offs about the sort of world we want to live in and experience and leave to future generations and so on. And I think that the real failing in environmental law is that we don't adequately confront that is the sort of thing, and Doug may actually agree with me that this is a problem, we don't actually confront the nature of the choices we face, and that we don't have an institutional structure which is capable of doing that and which in many important ways accommodates the diversity of views and preferences that we have, and doesn't and this last point, since Coase was being invoked, one thing we always forget about Coase's essay is that in some respects his project was similar to Doug's, which puts him in very good company, which was a challenge to welfare economics. The whole point of the problem of social cost is to say that if you take Pigou on his own terms, he fails. That Pigou's solution, the whole point of treating the polluter and the polluted as equal is to say that under terms of welfare economics, there is no reason we should differentiate between them. What we forget is at the very end of his essay, Coase refers to one of his mentors, Frank Knight, and to say, look, one of the things we've left off the table is the fact that a lot of these judgments are at base ethical, and that if we really want to have the sort of society we want, we have to realize that they're ethical questions. And that is, I think, certainly those are questions that I think Doug puts before us, and they're very welcome questions. And even if I disagree with some of the solutions, it is certainly useful to have a work that causes us to have these sorts of discussions as opposed to discussions about whether or not we adequately accounted for the costs of losing fish in cooling intake structures and power plants and what have you.
Well, thank you, both of you. So, Doug, maybe I should give you an opportunity to address one specific point that each of the commentators has made. So, for Amy, it's very clear, since you put this much stress on restoring causality and attached to that responsibility, do you think that the precautionary principle hangs together with that argument, or is it doing a different kind of job for you?
Definitely. So I do invoke the precautionary principle, which is a kind of unfashionable thing to do, particularly in America. And I do it, I think, in a way that's trying to recover an earlier, and I think the original understanding of the precautionary principle, which is that it's not meant to be a decision-making heuristic that applies in particular policy domains. It's not working at a kind of micro policy level. It's working instead on a more macro level. It's meant to be more akin to what the Hippocratic Oath is for doctors. So if we think about the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm, it's subject to all the critiques that people have levied against the precautionary principle. It seems to be absolutist. It seems to be ignoring opportunity costs. If we followed it literally, it would lead to absurd consequences. Doctors have to harm. They have to stick us with needles. They have to reset broken bones. They have to make trade-offs between the benefits of a medicine and its side effects. They have to do that all the time. But what the Hippocratic Oath does is it says you can't just devolve that responsibility into a cost-benefit formula. You can't just outsource the responsibility. First, do no harm, but most basically means be moral. Be aware that you stand in a relationship of particular ethical responsibility, that there's a patient who is vulnerable and dependent on your judgment. And the exercise of that judgment has to be imbued with a heightened sense of awareness and importance. And originally, I think the precautionary principle was trying to do a similar kind of, ethical stimulating effect at the level of political communities. It was intended to say that if you're going to engage in an action that might have serious, irreversible, or catastrophic consequences, particularly for the others of environmental law, future generations, other nations, non-human life forms, all the people who don't have political standing and don't even count in welfare economics in a certain way. Think about the fact that those entities stand in a relationship of dependency and vulnerability. They're dependent on the exercise of your sound and ethical judgment. So I think that's all the precautionary principle originally was trying to do. Now, what's really uncomfortable is that if we trace the genealogy of the precautionary principle, we find that it emerges in Weimar Germany, and it emerges through the writings of one of Carl Schmitt's closest colleagues. And it's really associated with a kind of growing, deep, self-conscious nationalism that we all know led to a horrible place. And so it's understandable, and throughout the book I try to acknowledge this. This is all the stories about eco-fascism, being kind of deeply embedded in the DNA of the environmental movement. Here we have some historical support for that awkward claim. My argument is that we've kind of overlearned the lesson of the 20th century. We've become so fearful of those awkward, awful, horrific places that self-conscious nationalism might lead us, that we've instead embraced this opposite extreme, which is a kind of welfare economics denial that there even is something like a political community, that there even is something like a state, and that when that state engages in death, like capital punishment, that it's somehow qualitatively different from any other death that happens. We want to deny that. But when we deny that, then we lose the unit holder that's able to think about intergenerational justice. What do we owe to the future? or international justice. What do we owe to India and Bangladesh by virtue of our greenhouse gas emissions? We no longer have a way of talking about that because the unit of a kind of supra-individual political community has disappeared. It's washed out. It's just rounded out in the models. And I think we're ultimately not going to be able to solve our problems without some language like that being brought back in. With respect to, should I?
Well, I actually have a question about that because you took the precautionary principle and went off in a direction of German romanticism and nationalism. But one of the interesting things in the book, and I think it's right, is that you embed at least the intergenerational concerns in a history of American environmentalism, and you talk eloquently about Teddy Roosevelt being also eloquent about the unborn generations in the womb of time, and NEPA itself incorporates the precautionary principle. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt is about as American a character as you could imagine, and NEPA is a major achievement of American law at a time when nobody else had done that. So why have we forgotten our own history? And that's much more interesting than why did we rebel against German history, which I'm not sure we've done properly anyway.
Right. Well, that's a difficult question. I mean, my sense would simply be that we're living in Reagan's world now. When I was 7 years old, this person came into office and started kind of inculcating a culture in which the locus of efficacy and possibility and progress is in the market and in the individual, and it's not in government. And I don't think we've really gotten out of that. So now when we think of government, even on the left, we're still in Reagan's world because we think of, well, how can we have good governance? How can we subject government to good accountability measures? And how can we treat government not as an honorable civil service, but we treat it instead as a unit in our operation that needs to be, brought into a kind of better alignment with the real interests, which are, of course, the individual consumer interest out there in the private sphere. So the language of the public, the language of political communities coming together and expressing a kind of shared sense of purpose and ambition, I think we've kind of lost it. And
so I think that's a great segue to a conversation between you and Jonathan. I mean, first of all, I have to say that talking about Reagan's world immediately makes me want to think of an Andrew Wyeth picture, but maybe featuring the Reagan office building somewhere in the distance. But there is a convergence between the two of you. I have to confess, Jonathan, that I was expecting you to say something different, and in fact, you both converge in saying that cost-benefit analysis elides politics, in a sense. So where is and also, I think Doug agrees that there are institutional ways in which cost-benefit analysis, as it's practiced, narrows the limits of the permissible, I mean, what you can consider and what not. So where is the disagreement between the two of you? Is it in the type of institutional structure that would elevate the politics? Is it in what is being elided? So, specifically, and I don't think we've dwelt on this enough, Doug keeps harping on excluded voices, whereas you're talking about voices that we very much are aware of, and we haven't heard them. I mean, you're talking about the aspen, the elk, and the wolf. Doug is talking about intergenerational, interspecies, and international. That's a little bit different from the aspen, the wolf, and the elk. So I'd like you to talk about, how you differ on your shared notion that welfare economics elides politics.
Well, I'd say a couple of things. I mean, one, I know one place where Doug and I would diverge is that I don't see the use of cost-benefit analysis and other efforts to welfare maximization efforts in the process of collective decision-making as the height of individualism. I think as Doug, in fact, and I think Doug's analysis actually kind of undermines that claim, because one of the things he points out is that the utilitarian calculus that is engaged in by agencies in a lot of these contexts treats people as cogs, not as individual moral agents. Now, my solution to that is not to assume that we necessarily need a different sort of political process for collective decision making. It is to question whether or not whether or not politics, and in particular the state, is the sole or even primary means of collective engagement. I reject that premise, and I think that premise is implicit in a lot of Doug's discussion. I think we definitely disagree there. I also would. I think another thing that's implicit in a lot of Doug's analysis that I would disagree with is kind of this assumption that we need almost like a policy monoculture or a values monoculture, that we have to be climbing one mountain. And so in terms of our underlying preferences or underlying premises, I think that's where I think, in terms of application in particular areas, I think that, I happen to think, I know at one point he discusses the usefulness of market failure analysis in agency decision making. I happen to think that's very valuable because it actually can lead you to a type of analysis that doesn't engage in welfare maximization through calculation, but rather can lead you to a form of analysis that looks at institutional structures and institutional imperfections and a way of trying to shore them up in a way that I think is a lot more humble than believing we can, kind of Robert Stavins style, calculate everything and come up with the right number. Whether we can instead kind of try and get the institutions right with some degree of confidence that if we do that, things will play out in an unpredictable but yet proper way. And I certainly lean a lot more in that direction than I would suspect Doug does.
Yes, do you want to respond to that?
Sure. Yeah, I actually think Professor Adler and I actually share a lot in this area. I mean, I think we both agree in theory that consequentialist, utilitarian, or welfarist approaches have this kind of eroding anti-individualist aspect. We both agree in practice that the institutional practice of cost-benefit analysis is broken in lots of ways. And the Hurricane Katrina Army Corps example that I have in the book really brings that out. I agree with Professor Adler. It's an example of bad cost-benefit analysis. What worries me is that I've never seen a good cost-benefit analysis. And in fact, I see the cost-benefit analysis not being used to guide good decision-making, but rather being used to kind of provide ex post cover for a decision that was made for other reasons and with other values at stake. And I think we both share a desire for those values to be directly invoked and directly contested and directly addressed. Where we might disagree, I don't know about this. I'd be curious to hear your reaction. I feel that given the nature of the problems we face in the 21st century, policy problems, not just climate change, which I focus on a lot, but systemic financial risk, infectious diseases, global, potentially catastrophic policy risks that kind of exceed the capacity of any individual agency, of any individual country, of any individual theoretical framework. These kinds of risks, I think, have kind of put us now at a moment where our grand bargain of limited government with a robust civil society in exchange for a government that, maybe is not going to be there to help out when we've got lots of spillovers, when we've got lots of Pigouvian negative externalities, we'll accept those. We'll accept the rough edges of our civil society in order to have the benefit of living in a regime with more freedom. So we effectively hobbled our government, and we did that very well. And now the question is, can limited government continue in an era where we face potentially unlimited harms? And what I'd like to see is a Donnybrook where we actually confront that question so that we can decide, are we at the end of the day more libertarian, like Professor Adler, or are we more, Kumbiosis Kaiser communitarians? And once we decide that, then we can focus our energies. We can focus on EPA or passing cap and trade, or we can focus on, the civil society and the private sector and greening Walmart. And we can decide once and for all what's the path going to be. But this current awkward, uneasy, and unresolved stasis it's the fast train to nowhere, in my view.
Well, of course, one could take that as illustrative of part of Jonathan's critique against you. because once and for all doesn't
Yeah.
hold in his
Yeah.
model of humility, because he's proposing the classic, 50 states, 50 labs, lots of experimentation, many mountains all at the same time, and you're suggesting one grand Götterdämmerung, cataclysmic
Yeah.
confrontation of competing ideologies in a book which is lauded with the word humility.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, so I wonder whether you accept his criticism that you want to drop the economic or come off the economics mountain and get onto the morality mountain, but there you see a single peak.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so that's a very sharp and fair question. I think I'm
I
sort
don't
of.
think you do, but make the
Yeah,
argument.
yeah, no, I certainly don't. I mean, that sounds, terribly hegemonic, and I certainly don't. And I actually don't. I agree that we don't want a kind of national level grand once and for all. We're going to decide we're pro-climate or anti-climate. And I actually think the
We
path.
actually had a decision on Tuesday, which arguably was like your Donnybrook.
Well, but in a sense, the environmental movement has had this incredible flip-flop over the last 30 years in its attitude toward national regulation and preemption. And when the politics favored progressive environmentalism at the national level, we were all about it. And then now, the politics have shifted, and hope for climate policy was emerging at the state level. And so the desire for that national uniform once and for all resolution quickly retreated. My own view is that the problem is sufficiently complex and sufficiently threatening to so many different aspects of the way we've ordered our world, literally for the last 3 or 4 centuries, that it's going to take a long time for people to internalize what this new way of living has to be. And it's something that law is not going to accomplish. It can't be a top-down EPA or congressional imposition. It has to be something more bottom-up. It has to be something on the order of the cultural transformation that eventually led to the abolition of slavery. I really do believe it has to be on that order. And in that sense, local, community,
Including
state.
the Civil War.
Well, unfortunately, it's hard for me to argue with that. Yeah.
Can I jump in here?
Absolutely, do.
Because I want to suggest, I'm afraid we're getting bogged down in all of this sort of hand-wringing about this, enormous town hall meeting that I guess we have to have and all come to agreement on our values. But when Jonathan said the thing about the elks and the wolves and the aspens in Yellowstone, I was wondering whether there's a tendency of people of Jonathan's persuasion to overstate the extent to which all of these environmental problems sort of flounder on these value disagreements. And I want to suggest that, in fact, what happens often with the use of cost-benefit analysis is not that a set of sort of genuine value disagreements held by different factions of the citizens are coming to blows, but rather that very instrumental values held by industry are being magnified and the values of the citizens are being erased, essentially, because what cost-benefit analysis essentially does is to create this space of indeterminacy that actually allows the person with the biggest guns, with the most resources, with the most money to hire an economist to make the case. And so, yeah, maybe sometimes there's disagreement about elks and wolves and aspens, but there's no disagreement that unless we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, there aren't going to be any wolves or any elk or any aspens in Yellowstone, unless they all start trekking north, right? So it seems to me that there are a whole set of issues about which what the facts turn out to be is actually quite clear. And the question is how to design environmental standards that help to actually bring to bear the values of the citizenry. Everybody wants clean water. Everybody wants air that doesn't make them sick. Everybody wants a planet that's not going to reach all sorts of tipping points that are going to lead to global disaster. And so actually this all comes to another question for Doug. When you were talking about your mountains and how we have to go down the one mountain and up the other mountain. And you were saying at one point in your remarks that it all kind of turns on how the EPA interprets the Clean Air Act. And I was very struck by that. I think you said that, you know, if Lisa Jackson just interprets the Clean Air Act robustly enough, we can get to the other mountain or something like that. And I've been thinking about that a lot recently, and you know, it looks to me like what at least is happening at this point under the Clean Air Act in terms of greenhouse gas regulation is basically technology-based standards, right? Because there's no evidence that they're moving forward with actual national ambient air quality standards, which would be the health-based standard that would really be technology forcing. At this point, I think they're just moving forward very slowly on new source performance standards, which are technology-based standards. But you know, in your book, technology-based standards is in some ways, I think, the main alternative standard that you put forward as an alternative to, as a good alternative to cost-benefit analysis. And I, of course, agree with you on that. But one of the, you know, great points that you make about cost-benefit analysis and its problems is that it's only incremental. And this is really the point of your mountain analogy, is that cost-benefit analysis is can only get us incremental moves from the status quo, and that's essentially its problem, right? That's why we can't get down off the mountain. But I'm afraid that technology-based standards essentially do the same thing to the extent that they're really bound by, if not existing technologies, existing visions of what technology can be. And you really see this in what's likely to come out of the new source performance standard process from EPA, right? I mean, what we're looking at, if we're lucky, getting from EPA regulation of greenhouse gases at this point is standards that tell coal-fired power plants that they have to be a little bit more efficient. That's what the technology-based standards are going to get us. And that's not what we need. That's not going to get us there. We need windmills. We need the standard that says, you know, tear down the coal-fired power plant and build a windmill. So I guess my question is, you know, how do we get that?
So Doug, I want to let you have a word on technology-based standards before going out to the audience and asking what questions you have. But Lisa, sorry, you were talking about Lisa Jackson, Amy. I want to press you on one thing, because I think that in putting Jonathan in his place, you may have created a sort of institutional question that I'm not sure is resolved. I mean, in a sense, Jonathan's argument has an institutional corollary. It's the experimental society and lots of small-scale experimentation. And you can tell whether things are doing well or not. Of course, it is the incrementalist muddling through solution. But you said that that's not where the disagreements are. Okay, but doesn't that just shift the locus of the disagreement? So it's not between the elk, aspen, and wolf trio. But what about the people who are saying that we don't want to see our jobs migrating south while we see the elk, aspen, and wolf migrating north? Where are those people who are actually quite a well-populated class going with to resolve their institutional queries?
I mean, I guess what I mean to say is not that I'm not disagreeing with Jonathan that there are different people who have different values about the elk and the aspen. What I'm saying is I think there's a large area of environmental issues where if we can just understand the facts, there's actually an enormous amount of agreement on the values. I think most people in this country, as I said, value the health of their children. They value access to clean water and clean air, and value not having the planet implode. So I wasn't trying to say that there aren't also areas of disagreement, but I think we ought to be able to at least move forward on the areas of agreement by finding standards that don't invite the kind of distortion by political power imbalances that are invited by cost-benefit analysis.
So EPA has had to confront the question of avoiding values by going to technology-based standards at other times in its history, for instance with toxics, when they got completely stuck on risk assessment, and Congress actually told them these are the chemicals you have to regulate using technology-based standards. So I don't know what you think about that as a way out.
I do try to resuscitate the wisdom of technology-based standards in the book, but Professor Sinden's right that I should acknowledge that technology-based standards have become incrementalist in the sense that by fixing on language like feasibility or by simply just confronting the political reality that they don't want to shut down entire industries or large sections of industries, EPA has tended to only ratchet the technology forcing possibility up to a certain degree. And so it becomes incremental rather than transformative. I think so one thing to say is that the statutes would permit the agency, if it felt like it had more political capital, to be more aggressive than that. But one value I see in the best available technology standard framework is an expressive one, in that it says that the political community that adopted these statutes has decided that the level of environmental protection we want, the quality of the water, the quality of the air, is the best we can do. And what that means is that in practice, when we implement it, this doesn't mean we're going to have 100% clean air or 100% clean water. It means there's going to be a shortfall. There's going to be a residual amount of harm and pollution that's still there. And it stands as a kind of moral remainder. It stands as a sign of failure. It stands as a sign of the necessity of trying to do better tomorrow, of trying to ratchet the standards tighter. Whereas when we do cost-benefit analysis, the signal we send to ourselves is we have the right amount of death. We have the right amount of involuntary premature death. And I don't think that's a signal, I share Amy's view, I don't think that's a signal actually that most Americans would agree with.
Thank you. So the audience has been very patient, and I think we have about 15 minutes for questions and answers. If you could identify yourself, ask your question crisply, and identify who you're asking, that would be great. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Victor Stone, and my question is, I guess, to the whole panel. Ultimately, I think what's going on is a failure, frankly, of science and public relations. I heard the comment made by Mr. Kaiser that clearly there's an immediacy of a cataclysmic threat. When that happens, you get exactly what you're asking for. The START Treaty on nuclear weapons, people recognize there's an immediacy of a cataclysmic threat, and there's no cost-benefit analysis when we go to negotiate it. But whether we have wolves in Yellowstone or whether we're going to let people kill themselves by smoking or cause somebody else to pay more taxes for the hospital, I think the way this country has evolved, they don't see the immediacy of that threat. They're not willing to have Big Brother make a decision like he will on nuclear weapons. And therefore, cost-benefit analysis is the way we have decided that little people, administrators and judges, can keep their values on the side and weigh the costs, the price, to the parties involved, however inaccurate that is. So my question is, why do you, I heard you use the word utopia a minute ago. Your utopia is certainly not the utopia in China, where their dirty air is something they're willing to live with. They don't see that as an immediate threat of a cataclysm. So I just want to know which issues, because I think you're vastly overstating which issues we all think have the immediacy of a cataclysm or that have been sold to a majority of Americans and their representatives to move to this other system.
Yeah. The great economist Ken Boulding once wryly said that it's hard to organize a long-term crisis. And the problem with climate change is precisely the temporal dislocation. The decisions we make now have this incredible inertia, both because of capital endurance in the energy sector and also because the greenhouse gas emissions, some of these things live centuries in the atmosphere. So that there's a kind of dislocation of impact and decision making, so that the cataclysm is in the models with enormous scientific certainty, but it's out there in the far future. One thing that will help is that we're starting to get a kind of an ability to attribute extreme weather events to climate change. Again, still probabilistically, but we can say more likely than not, for instance, that the Pakistan flooding, the Russian fires, even get this, last year's severe snowstorms on the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, climate change. NOAA has determined that it was because less ice is available in the summer to re-radiate heat back in the Arctic. So more heat gets absorbed in the summer and then eventually re-released during the winter. And that enormous release changed what had been a dominant cyclical around the North Pole into a pushing down of northeastern New England. So we can expect that, Senator Inhofe should know about this, right? That's an impact of climate change. I think when we start getting better at communicating that linkage and maybe trying to kind of bring the quirky temporal features of the problem into people's minds somehow, that might change. Actually, Dr. Jasanoff is much better positioned to speak about this than I am, because it's an issue that's not only about the science-democracy divide, but it's about science communication and about how authoritative epistemic communities get created and how sometimes they see themselves come crashing down like the climate science community has. It's a challenge.
Do the other panelists have anything to contribute on this?
Well, it is two things. One, I think we put ourselves in dangerous territory when we suggest it's a failure of science. Because, I mean, even on climate change, right, is the target 350 parts per million, 450 parts per million, 400 parts per million? On what time scale? What are the consequences that we are trying to avoid, and what is the moral obligation that various communities have to one another and nations have to one another in the interim, given that some amount of change, climate change, is already built into the climate system? And science isn't going to answer those questions for us. It's going to inform our answers. But at the end of the day, certain normative judgments that we have are going to drive those decisions. And when we obscure that, we, I think, put scientific authority in a more precarious place, because we ask it to do more than it can do. And then when someone points out that we've done that, then its overall authority to inform the process actually gets diminished, and we leave ourselves worse off. The other thing I would just say is that in the long-term crisis thing is that I happen to believe that political institutions are far less able to deal with longer time horizons than alternatives. Now, I'm not saying there's anything that's good, but there's a whole bunch of comparative analyses of various sorts of investments and maintenances and the like that show that political institutions have a much harder time than non-political institutions in dealing with long time horizons.
What's an example of a non-political institution?
We can be talking about corporations. We can be talking about private contractual communities. We can be talking about lots of other ways of organizing ourselves outside of the state.
At a moment when the standard critique of American market failure is the inability to look beyond the quarterly.
I think that when we look at a comparative institutional analysis, that critique is problematic, and if we look at the recently passed financial regulatory reform legislation and whether or not it actually addresses the things that need to be addressed, we see confirmation that the comparative institutional analysis is a lot more sobering and perhaps depressing than we would like, because as bad as private institutions can be in this regard, political institutions have not shown themselves to be superior, and that makes certain problems like climate change really, really difficult. But I do think we can't say, oh, look, private time horizons are really short, therefore we must have the alternative until we know if the alternative is going to outperform.
Just a couple of things. I worry that there's a certain quality of a self-fulfilling prophecy about these protestations that the state is incompetent to solve collective problems, and that in fact that's part of what we've been suffering from since the Reagan era. That, so statements that the state is incompetent then result in defunding of the state and tying the state's hands, and then we can point to it and say, ha, see, the state doesn't work. But I agree with what Jonathan is saying about the danger that in the climate change context, the important value judgments are getting sort of shoved under the rug. And I would just add to that, to sort of build on what Doug was saying earlier, that in fact, cost-benefit analysis is part of that problem, and the social cost of carbon that Doug was referencing earlier is a nice illustration, right? Because this government task force determined that the social cost of carbon is $22 per ton. I don't know about you, but that doesn't communicate to me as a member of the public very much about the problem. It turns out that if we actually analyze that number, we find out that if we in fact use that number in all of our cost-benefit analyses and apply those cost-benefit analyses to all of our government actions over the next decades, that in fact we won't get anywhere near the relatively mild goal of 450 parts per million that the IPCC has said is the minimum that we have to do to avoid catastrophic climate change. So that's another example of cost-benefit analysis really sort of making opaque the real issues that are at stake.
And if I could just jump in, I mean, one question is what's the alternative, right? So like in the climate change context, we don't need to have a lot more certainty about the effects of continued greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere to say that there is a normative argument for developed countries helping developing countries. It doesn't matter whether or not the sea level rises, a small amount, a large amount, certainly in our legal and ethical tradition, developed countries have contributed to what we would normally recognize as nuisances that violate the rights, the pre-political rights of many communities around the world. And that is, it should be, and I've written this to my libertarian friends saying, look, okay, so maybe Al Gore is exaggerating. It does, even by your own estimates, there are normative wrongs that we have contributed to that we are ignoring. So let's assume, that Patrick Michaels or Bob Balling or whichever skeptic you like is actually correct about the atmospheric projections. It doesn't matter because we still can recognize a normative problem based on what we claim to be the normative framework we're operating under. And I think that's an example of where we can in some ways really simplify the choices we face and say, to my fellow conservatives and libertarians, look, if you really say you believe in property rights, why aren't we doing more to deal with the consequences of flooding in Bangladesh that we have contributed to? And it doesn't matter if we've contributed a little bit or a lot, our obligation to at the very least indemnify should be incontrovertible. And then we can have a discussion, okay, well, how do we operationalize that? What set of policy mixes do we do that? How do we incorporate that into the various other societal decisions we do? I think political structures are easier to handle that sort of conversation once we've clarified the issue than they are to identify the optimal price of carbon to impose through some sort of cap and trade regime. So I'm not trying to defend everything that has been done in the name of these sorts of approaches, but I think if we take them seriously, we actually can clarify a lot.
But does that suggest that we don't actually need to get into political theory if you and Doug are agreeing at the end of the day that you're responsible for what needs to be done in Bangladesh?
There are some questions where we can. I mean, there are some contexts in which we can. There'll be plenty of other areas where Doug and I will still have to get into political theory.
Other questions from the audience? Yeah.
Bruce Myers with the Environmental Law Institute. This is a great panel. Cost benefits taken a pretty good beat down today. What if anything is the positive role for cost benefit going forward? And I welcome all the views on that. And I'd just like to add that the elk Yellowstone metaphor really resonated with me, and I think it has with others, given how many times it's come up.
I'll say a little bit myself. The very first piece I ever wrote as a really young person who had just environmental law to her name and hadn't started inventing an intellectual field around the research that I do, was called Negotiation or Cost-Benefit Analysis. And it was prompted by my early foray into comparative studies of regulatory policy. And I came to EPA and I did my field work and so on and so forth, and I walked away with bundles of papers that high of cost-benefit analyses, economic analyses performed under the Clean Air Act and so forth. Lead was one of the cases I studied. Then I went across the Atlantic to England and asked to see their documents, and they were regulating lead, a bit later than us, but they were regulating it. They gave me their documents. And there was a paragraph in the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution's report that said, well, you don't really need lead in the paint with which you paint highway divider stripes because there's an alternative available. And, you know, it led me into a perennial question about what is it that makes us culturally need to produce, you know, that objective seeming documentation, whereas other countries go about doing it in other ways. And it came back to institutions, it came back to trust, it came back to how people go about making collective judgments and collective decisions. That's a dimension that we actually haven't addressed at all today, but it is extraordinarily deeply embedded. And we are a country of heterogeneity, and one way that we've papered over that heterogeneity is that we've actually decided to commit all of our decision-making, or great parts of our decision-making, to these seemingly objective measures, because then you don't have to fight. I mean, so putting the values aside is actually a consequence of a certain kind of social makeup and so on. So, I mean, I have a quite deep ongoing set of conversations to have with Doug about how you rebuild the institutions to deal with the values when you've actually gone over to the objectivist side to avoid, you know, some of these kinds of questions that are actually unresolvable. And that's the place where Amy and Jonathan, you too, would, I mean, especially Amy, I was very interested at your critique of Sunstein and with whoever the co-author of the moment happens to be, and you know, but he's an OIRA and you're not.
Oh, you noticed that.
So that's a partial answer to your question. I don't know if other people have responses.
I think cost-benefit analysis can be very useful in exactly the way that Sheila was just describing. If we're talking about should the standard be 5 parts per billion versus 7 parts per billion, right? At that point, we've already done a great deal to promote environmental health and safety, and now we're looking for a way to politically legitimate kind of, I don't want to call it hair splitting, but it's a more incremental kind of policymaking. And Ted Porter has a wonderful book called Trust in Numbers that talks about the rise of cost-benefit analysis in the American context in precisely these terms. It's a way to legitimate state action where we don't have a kind of culturally integrated community. We have a chaotic, diverse community. You know, analytically or more academically, I could imagine cost-benefit analysis working very well if we make sure that we keep the priority of questions distinct. So we right now try to run intergenerational justice through something called the discount rate, when what we should be doing is asking the question the scientists are. Can we tolerate 2 degrees? Can we tolerate 350 parts per million? We should set that standard, and then we can model a shadow market in which a market rate of interest will arise through a complex shadow market process, but it'll arise only because we've first put in place sustainability constraints on the loading of the atmosphere that endow future generations with a right to basic stability in the climate system. So cost-benefit analysis can be kind of tamed, but the worry is that its language seems so attractive, particularly in the American political context, that it just spills over into domains well outside its competence.
So
I would just say briefly, you know, Doug, that actually, and I know you know this, in England, their version of the social cost of carbon, they call it something different. I forget what it is. But I think it's sort of what you're talking about, right? Because what they do, instead of what we did, they pick the goal first. And they say, well, if we're going to get to 450 parts per million by 2050, you know, how much do we have to spend for each ton of carbon to get it out of the atmosphere? And that's how they come up with their dollar figure, which I think is similar to what you're talking about.
Jonathan,
Just on cost, I think as a heuristic, cost, the framework can be very useful. I think the real problem comes with the desire to monetize everything. And Doug has a passage in his book where he makes this really important point that economists should have learned in school but forget, which is most of the circumstances in which we are asking a government agency to do a cost-benefit analysis are precisely those areas where we don't have the market transactions and other discovery mechanisms in place to actually have reliable numbers. So we're always looking for cost-benefit analysis where we're least able to do it. And that's really the problem. Whereas if what we're doing is kind of almost more this kind of holistic, you know, let's make sure we're aware of what the trade-offs are and aware of what our choices are, I think it's very valuable, and I think it's especially valuable for government agencies to do to encourage transparency and accountability for the decisions they make. One historical note I'll just make, that there's always an irony in discussing cost-benefit analysis and environmental policy, because one of the first some of the first pushes for cost-benefit analysis in federal policy came in part from environmental groups that were concerned about all of these public works projects that we were building that weren't justified economically, environmentally, or not, but because particular interest groups wanted them. And by some accounts, we would have dammed the Grand Canyon had it not been for a cost-benefit analysis that showed it was economically insane, let alone the other moral and other reasons we should have objected to that. And so, cost-benefit analysis has actually, at times, produced results that I think many environmentalists would favor.
Just one quick addendum on that. The damming the Grand Canyon actually passed cost-benefit analysis. It's just that nuclear appeared to be an even more cost-effective option. That was the outcome of that RAND study.
Yeah, so we're beyond our time. I was reminded in reading Doug's book of the Bobby Kennedy quote about GDP and the limits of measurement. And there's a long, eloquent passage, but he talks about how it measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And it tells us everything about America except why we're proud that we're Americans. So I think that we should end on the note of humility that several, maybe all of our panelists have sounded. Thank them, realize this is an ongoing conversation, and adjourn for the day. So join me in thanking them.